A moonless night draped itself across the waters of Lingayen Gulf on January 6, 1945. The sea rolled heavy and dark, the horizon indistinguishable from the sky, as if the world itself had been reduced to two shades of black. Somewhere beyond the curtain of night, the Japanese moved. Wooden landing barges and makeshift transports churned across the Gulf, their engines muffled, their prows slicing toward the beaches of Luzon. Each barge carried soldiers, supplies, or weapons desperately needed to halt the inevitable, the American return. For the men packed inside those crude vessels, it was a voyage of duty and desperation, and every wave carried them closer to the firestorm awaiting ashore. But the Gulf did not belong to them, not anymore. Cutting low through the swells came the silhouettes of American PT boats, small, fast, and lethal. Their hulls, built of nothing more than layered plywood, gleamed with spray as they knifed through the darkness. Triple-Packard engines roared, leaving white wakes that curled behind like serpents. To the Japanese, these vessels seemed to materialize out of the sea itself. To the young American sailors at the controls, this was another night of tension, another night when survival depended on speed, instinct, and luck. Aboard PT-223, Seaman Second Class Walter Harmon gripped the wheel with both hands, the vibration of the engines rattling up his arms. His eyes strained against the night as he listened for the sound of enemy motors. At any moment, the black horizon might bloom with muzzle flashes, and then the calm would shatter. He thought of his home in Oregon, the smell of pine trees after the rain, and the quiet of a small town far removed from the war. But the memories vanished as a flare arced high above the Gulf, bursting into harsh white light. Suddenly, the sea came alive. Hundreds of silhouettes revealed in stark relief. The Japanese barges were out there, clustered and advancing. "Contact ahead!" came the shout from the bow gunner. The order went down the line. Harmon pushed the throttles forward. The PT boat leapt across the water, bow lifting as though eager for the fight. Torpedo tubes, painted dark green, pointed toward the swarm of targets. The machine gunners cocked their weapons, their fingers tightening on cold triggers. For an instant, time seemed to hang. Two forces locked in a silent duel under the ghostly glare of flares. Then the Gulf erupted. Tracer fire lanced across the waves in arcs of orange and red. The PT boats poured streams of .50 caliber rounds into the wooden barges, splinters exploding into the air as men screamed and weapons clattered into the sea. Japanese gunners returned fire, their muzzle flashes blinking like fireflies in the night, the rounds hammering into the water around the Americans. Some shots tore into the PT hulls themselves, punching ragged holes through plywood and scattering shrapnel across the decks. Harmon twisted the wheel hard to starboard, weaving the boat in a serpentine path. Behind him, the roar of engines mixed with the cries of men and the savage rhythm of machine guns. A torpedo hissed from its tube and slid beneath the surface, its wake glowing faintly white. Moments later, a distant barge exploded in a thunderous blossom of fire. The concussion rippled across the water, lifting the PT boat's bow as though the sea itself had flinched. But there was no time to cheer. More barges pressed on, countless silhouettes stretching into the Gulf. The Americans knew they were outnumbered, yet they also knew the truth. Their job was not to stop every barge, only to disrupt, delay, and scatter the enemy before they could reach the invasion beaches. Every barge sunk meant fewer Japanese rifles firing at Marines and soldiers who would soon come ashore. Every disrupted landing meant more American lives saved. The battle raged in flashes of light and sudden bursts of sound. The PT boats darted in and out of the formations like wolves among a herd, striking from the dark, vanishing, then striking again. Japanese troops, many packed shoulder to shoulder in their craft, died by the dozens, their vessels shredded by gunfire or splintered by torpedoes. The Gulf was littered with burning wreckage, the flames painting the water in hues of orange and red. Smoke drifted across the waves, mingling with the salty spray and the acrid stench of cordite. In the chaos, Harmon glimpsed another PT boat blaze away with its guns, its crew silhouetted in the glow of their tracers. They fought in pairs and small packs, never lingering long enough to become fixed targets. Their greatest strength was mobility, the ability to strike, retreat, and strike again before the enemy could coordinate. To the Japanese, it must have felt like being attacked by phantoms, yet danger was everywhere. One barge, riddled with holes but still afloat, veered straight toward PT-223. Its bow gun spat fire, and Harmon ducked as rounds snapped overhead. The PT boat swung wide, its stern guns unleashing a torrent that shredded the attackers. The Japanese vessel veered, caught fire, and then capsized, its burning hull rolling onto its side before vanishing beneath the waves. Hours stretched into eternity. To the sailors, each minute felt like a lifetime of noise, violence, and sweat. Communication was shouted, orders drowned by gunfire. The men's ears rang from the constant thunder of 50-caliber machine guns. Spent shells rolled across the deck like marbles, glinting in the sporadic light of flares. For some, the fear was numbing. For others, it sharpened every sense to a razor's edge. As dawn's first light tinged the horizon, the Gulf was a graveyard. Dozens of barges lay shattered, burning, or drifting aimlessly with no crews left alive. The waters carried bodies, planks, and weapons, all testaments to the ferocity of the night. The PT boats, scarred but afloat, circled back toward their anchorage. Their mission was not to annihilate every enemy, but to bleed the reinforcement effort so deeply that it failed before it reached the sand. For Harmon and his crew, exhaustion replaced adrenaline. Smoke clung to their clothes, sweat stung their eyes, and their throats were raw from shouting. Yet in the silence after the guns, they knew what they had accomplished. The invasion of Luzon, perhaps the most ambitious American landing since Leyte, had been safeguarded in part by their night's work. The Japanese had been bloodied, their attempt to reinforce the Gulf disrupted. This was only the beginning. For the days to come, Lingayen Gulf would see more fire, more sacrifice, and more desperate clashes by land, sea, and air. But in those hours before dawn, the Mosquito fleet had once again proved its worth, that even the smallest vessels, crewed by ordinary men, could shape the fate of empires. And as the sun climbed higher, its light fell upon a gulf scarred by smoke and wreckage, marking the opening chapter of the great struggle for Luzon. The morning sun rose over a battered Manila Bay in late 1944, its light falling upon a city once proud, now scarred by years of Japanese occupation. Smoke from scattered fires still clung to the ruins, and gaunt civilians moved like shadows among the rubble, their eyes carrying the weight of hunger and fear. For 3 long years, the Philippines had endured the brutal grip of the Japanese Empire. From the first landings in December 1941 through the fall of Bataan and Corregidor in 1942, the islands had been a showcase of Japanese dominance in the Pacific. Yet beneath the surface, resistance simmered, and every whispered rumor carried the same promise. General Douglas MacArthur would return. That promise had become more than a vow. It had hardened into prophecy. In March 1942, as he was evacuated from Corregidor under orders from President Roosevelt, MacArthur declared with simple, unforgettable words, "I shall return." Those words echoed in the hearts of Filipinos and Americans alike, a pledge that the Philippines would not be abandoned. Now, in early 1945, the promise was being fulfilled in steel and fire. The largest invasion force the Pacific had yet seen gathered off the coast of Luzon, its anchor point the wide, sheltered waters of Lingayen Gulf. The Gulf itself, broad and deep, offered the geography of destiny. Situated on the western shore of Luzon, it was the natural gateway for an invasion fleet. The beaches stretched long and flat, ideal for amphibious landings. Behind them lay the road to Manila, the crown jewel of the Philippines and the seat of Japanese occupation. Whoever held Luzon held the keys to the archipelago, and whoever held the Philippines controlled the shipping lanes to the East Indies and the South China Sea. For Japan, Luzon was a fortress meant to delay the inevitable. For the Allies, it was a springboard to victory. But taking Luzon would not be easy. By late 1944, the Japanese High Command had declared the Philippines to be part of their decisive battle area. They ordered massive reinforcements from Formosa, Indochina, and the home islands, pouring soldiers, weapons, and supplies into Luzon in a desperate attempt to build a final defensive bastion. Estimates suggest that nearly 260,000 Japanese troops were concentrated across the island, dug into mountain passes, coastal fortifications, and urban strongholds. They were prepared to fight not for days or weeks, but to the last man. The Japanese strategy depended heavily on sea lanes, using convoys of landing barges, fishing boats, and small transports to move men and equipment under cover of night. The Imperial Navy, battered after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, could no longer protect these routes with battleships or carriers. Instead, they relied on stealth, speed, and the willingness of their soldiers to endure incredible risk. Barges slipped across Lingayen Gulf like phantoms, hugging coastlines, dodging patrols, and praying the Americans would not intercept them. Each successful delivery of troops or ammunition promised another day of resistance ashore. Each interception spelled disaster. MacArthur's return was not only a matter of strategy, but of symbolism. To the Allied public, the Philippines carried emotional weight. It was here that America had first suffered its greatest defeat, where tens of thousands of men endured the Bataan Death March, and where the myth of Japanese invincibility had once been forged. To come back was to reclaim honor, to avenge the fallen, and to demonstrate the inexorable tide of American power. The campaign for Luzon was more than military. It was moral. That power assembled in staggering scale. By January 1945, the Allied Armada stretched across Lingayen Gulf as far as the eye could see. More than 800 vessels gathered. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and an endless procession of landing craft. The sky overhead belonged to the Americans, as waves of carrier-based aircraft and long-range bombers from Leyte scoured Japanese positions. The sea bristled with steel, while inland, Filipino guerrillas struck Japanese patrols, guiding American forces with intelligence gathered through years of underground resistance. The invasion was not merely an amphibious landing. It was a convergence of air, sea, and land power, combined with the will of a people who had never accepted conquest. For the Japanese, every calculation was grim. Their air forces had been shattered, their navy crippled, their supplies dwindling. Yet their orders were clear: resist at all costs, delay the Americans, and buy time for the homeland to prepare. Out of this desperation came the most infamous tactic of the war, the kamikaze. At Lingayen Gulf, American sailors would endure days of relentless suicide attacks from the skies, each one a fiery attempt to halt the invasion fleet. But even as kamikazes roared down from the heavens, Japanese commanders knew the beaches could not be held without reinforcements delivered by sea. It was here that the American PT boats came into their own. Nicknamed the Mosquito Fleet, they were small, fast, and designed to strike at night. Lingayen Gulf was a hunting ground made for them. While destroyers and cruisers guarded the larger fleet, PT boats prowled the coastal waters, their Packard engines growling, their crews straining eyes and ears against the dark. Every barge spotted meant an opportunity to cripple Japan's reinforcement effort. Every night patrol carried the chance to tilt the balance of the invasion before dawn. The road back to Luzon was thus a clash not only of armies, but of strategies. On one side, Japan gambled on stealth and sacrifice, hoping to shuttle enough men across the Gulf to slow the American juggernaut. On the other, the Allies wielded overwhelming force, determined to strike down every reinforcement attempt before it reached the beaches. Between them, Lingayen Gulf became a stage where wooden barges met plywood torpedo boats, where desperate gambits met relentless pursuit. By the first week of January 1945, the moment had arrived. American transports lined the Gulf, engines idling, as troops prepared to storm ashore. Japanese barges crept across the same waters, carrying reinforcements into the jaws of danger. Above them, kamikazes circled, diving into ships in bursts of flame. Beneath them, submarines lurked, and slicing between it all, the PT boats waited, small, swift, and merciless, ready to make the night itself their weapon. The invasion of Luzon was about to begin, and in the shadows of Lingayen Gulf, the fate of the Philippines would be decided. Spray lashed across the deck as the small craft pitched violently in the swells. The young ensign at the helm of PT 101 gripped the wheel with white knuckles, his heart pounding as the Packard engines roared behind him like unleashed thunder. The plywood hull beneath his feet seemed fragile against the black Pacific waves, and yet the boat responded with incredible agility, leaping over crests, banking hard into turns, and racing ahead at speeds that dwarfed anything else afloat in its size. Around him, his crew scrambled with gunners braced at their mounts, eyes sharp on the horizon. The sensation was unmistakable. They were not sailors aboard some massive warship of steel and armor, but hunters, light, fast, and dangerous. Out here, in the restless sea, the Mosquito Fleet was born. The name was apt. Like mosquitoes, these boats were small, elusive, and maddening to their enemies. Their bites, delivered in the form of torpedoes and machine gun fire, could cripple vessels many times their size. They swarmed in numbers, struck suddenly, and vanished into darkness before the enemy could deliver a crushing blow. In a war defined by vast carriers and towering battleships, the PT boat seemed almost an afterthought at first glance, yet their role grew to be indispensable, and nowhere would this be clearer than in the waters of the Philippines. The origins of the PT boat lay not in the grand shipyards of battleship construction, but in workshops where innovation thrived. Built primarily of laminated plywood rather than heavy steel, they were light enough to skim the waves, yet sturdy enough to carry deadly weapons. Their hulls, designed by companies such as Elco and Higgins Industries, reflected the creativity of American engineering during wartime. The simplicity of wood construction also meant they could be produced quickly and in large numbers, freeing up steel for larger warships and tanks. But lightness alone was not their weapon. At their core thundered 3 Packard Vi-12 marine engines, descendants of aircraft engines, each capable of 200 horsepower. Combined, they propelled the 80-foot boats to speeds approaching 40 knots, over 45 miles per hour. To a crewman crouched on deck, the roar of those engines was a physical force, shaking the hull and vibrating through bone and muscle. The smell of gasoline clung to every surface, and the risk of fire was ever present. Yet that speed was their lifeline, their shield, and their greatest offensive weapon. It allowed them to slip between larger ships, to chase down fleeing barges, and to disengage from combat before the enemy could mount an effective counterattack. They were not armored. Even rifle fire could punch holes through their plywood skins. Protection came only through agility, daring, and darkness. Their armament was deceptively heavy for such small craft. Along their sides ran 4 torpedo tubes, each holding a Mark 8 torpedo, deadly weapons capable of breaking the keel of a destroyer or transport. On deck, gunners manned twin 50-caliber Browning machine guns, their barrels protruding like stingers. Many boats were modified in the field with additional guns, 20mm Oerlikons, rocket launchers, or even scavenged 37mm cannons ripped from wrecked aircraft. Crews improvised constantly, turning each PT boat into a unique instrument of destruction. For men assigned to these boats, resourcefulness was as important as discipline. Training was grueling and relentless. New crews learned to handle their fragile yet ferocious vessels in rough seas, driving through stormy conditions where even destroyers hesitated. They practiced torpedo runs under simulated fire, rehearsed evasive maneuvers, and drilled night after night in recognition exercises. Theirs was a war fought in shadows, often without radar, dependent on eyesight, instinct, and the courage to close the gap before striking. Veterans remembered the sensation of salt spray freezing on their skin, of hands blistered from gripping cold steel, and of exhaustion from endless hours of waiting before the sudden, violent burst of combat. By 1942 and 1943, PT boats proved their worth in the Solomon Islands, where they harassed Japanese supply runs in what became known as the Tokyo Express. Small convoys of Japanese barges tried to slip reinforcements through narrow channels at night, but PT boats hunted them relentlessly, scattering troops into the sea and denying supplies to island garrisons. These early successes demonstrated a simple truth: Japan's empire depended on moving men and material across water, often in small, vulnerable craft, and the PT boats were designed to disrupt exactly that. It was not without cost. Many PT boats were lost to gunfire, grounding, or sudden explosions when their gasoline tanks ignited. Crews faced the terror of being stranded in shark-infested waters or captured by enemy patrols, yet their daring brought them notoriety, and sometimes even fame. One young lieutenant, John F. Kennedy, would later carry his war record with PT-109 into the political arena, forever linking the image of the Mosquito Fleet with American heroism. As the war advanced northward, the PT boats followed. By 1944, when MacArthur's forces struck at Leyte, PT squadrons were already there, prowling the coastal waters and ambushing Japanese reinforcement barges. They became an invisible shield, preventing the Japanese from consolidating their defenses. At night, their engines hummed low as they spread out across channels and gulfs, eyes scanning the dark horizon for the faint silhouette of a barge or the flicker of a cigarette on deck. When contact was made, they attacked swiftly, spraying gunfire before loosing torpedoes, then vanishing into the night before the enemy could rally. The Philippines campaign magnified their importance. The Japanese, cut off from major naval strength, relied on wooden landing craft to reinforce Luzon. To meet this threat, PT boats became hunters of barges, a role perfectly suited to their design. Each engagement was swift, chaotic, and brutal. Barges often burned, scattering troops into the sea where survival was unlikely. Yet for every destroyed craft, thousands of Allied soldiers on shore were spared from facing fresh enemy reinforcements. The Mosquito Fleet had found its greatest mission: interdiction warfare on a grand scale. The legacy of the PT boat lies not only in statistics, but in the courage of the men who sailed them. They were volunteers, many barely out of adolescence, thrust into one of the most dangerous assignments of the Pacific War. They endured nights of tension broken by sudden violence, days of fatigue and uncertainty, and the constant knowledge that their boats offered little defense if caught in open water by larger ships or aircraft. Yet they sailed willingly, driven by duty and by the thrill of commanding such agile machines. By the time the Americans advanced toward Luzon, the Mosquito Fleet was no longer an experiment. It was an integral weapon, feared by Japanese supply officers and respected by the high command. In Lingayen Gulf, their speed and stealth would once again prove decisive, swarming across the night waters to intercept reinforcements before they could reach the beaches. They were not battleships, nor carriers, nor even destroyers. They were something different, an expression of American ingenuity, industrial speed, and the relentless will to adapt. And as the invasion of Luzon loomed, the PT boats prepared to write their most dramatic chapter yet, prowling a gulf where every night held the promise of combat, and every dawn revealed the wreckage of their enemies. The sea was black glass under a new moon, broken only by the hum of engines and the creak of overloaded timbers. Dozens of Japanese landing barges pushed slowly across Lingayen Gulf, their bows cutting the dark water, their decks crowded with men who had been ordered into a journey few believed they would survive. Packed shoulder to shoulder, soldiers sat in silence, clutching rifles or staring into the night, their faces illuminated only when a cigarette ember briefly glowed before being hastily extinguished. The air smelled of gasoline, sweat, and fear. Every man aboard knew what stalked them: American patrols, submarines, and above all, the dreaded PT boats that prowled the Gulf like hungry predators. Still, they pressed forward. The Emperor had commanded, and failure meant dishonor. By late 1944, the Japanese position in the Philippines was unraveling. The shattering defeat at Leyte Gulf had stripped the Imperial Navy of its last coherent fleet, leaving only fragments, destroyers, barges, and small transports to contest Allied dominance. Luzon remained the linchpin of Japan's southern defenses, and Tokyo's generals were desperate to funnel reinforcements onto the island. Tens of thousands of troops were stranded on smaller islands, or waiting in Formosa and Indochina, with little hope of reaching the battlefield except by night runs across hostile waters. This was not a campaign of strength, but of desperation, a gamble on fragile wooden craft in the face of overwhelming American firepower. The Japanese relied on a patchwork fleet of Daihatsu landing barges, motorized wooden craft originally designed for coastal operations. Some were equipped with light machine guns or a small cannon. Many carried nothing but men, ammunition, and food. Their wooden hulls made them cheap and quick to build, but they were slow, rarely exceeding 8 knots, and dangerously vulnerable. A burst of machine gun fire could shred their sides, while a torpedo or depth charge would obliterate them instantly. Yet Japan had little else left to give. Convoys departed from Formosa, from Hainan, even from as far as Shanghai, threading their way south along coastlines to avoid American submarines. By the time they reached Lingayen Gulf, most were reduced in number, whittled down by air raids, breakdowns, and chance encounters with Allied patrols. Those that did make the Gulf crept forward under cover of darkness, praying for clouded skies and silent seas. Each successful landing promised another regiment ashore, another day of resistance against MacArthur's relentless advance. But each loss was catastrophic. A single destroyed barge could mean 200 men gone in minutes, rifles, mortars, and all. For the soldiers crammed into those boats, the voyage was a crucible of endurance. Many had already fought on Leyte or Mindoro, and carried wounds, hunger, and disease with them. The barges provided no comfort. Men sat on bare planks soaked with seawater, shivering in the night air, while officers whispered orders to keep silence absolute. Engines sputtered and coughed, threatening to die at the worst moment. Any flicker of light could betray them. When the wake of a PT boat appeared, long white streaks cutting across the Gulf, panic spread. Soldiers would reach for their weapons, knowing full well that their rifles were nearly useless against a vessel built for speed and armed with heavy guns. The contrast was stark. Against the calculated velocity of American PT boats, craft capable of darting in and out of battle at 40 knots, the Japanese convoys moved like lumbering shadows, blind and slow. Every advantage lay with the hunters. PT boats could strike a formation, unleash a torrent of machine gun fire or a torpedo, and vanish before the barges could react. The Gulf became a killing ground, where fragile wooden hulls splintered under the relentless stings of America's mosquito fleet. Yet still, the Japanese tried. For them, the reinforcement of Luzon was not optional. It was essential. The garrison there faced annihilation, unless men and supplies arrived in significant numbers. Officers assured their men that the Emperor's will was unbreakable, that sacrifice was noble, and that honor demanded the attempt. Some barges carried not only soldiers, but also barrels of rice, crates of ammunition, or even field artillery strapped precariously to their decks. Everything was bound for Luzon's shores, where a last stand against MacArthur's invasion awaited. The journeys themselves became acts of desperation, bordering on the suicidal. Barges crept close to shorelines to avoid detection, their crews praying that American aircraft would not appear at dawn. Sometimes they disguised themselves as fishing boats, nets hanging uselessly over the sides. More often, they relied simply on darkness and silence, hoping to pass unseen. When they were discovered, the result was chaos. Gunfire erupted across the water, tracer rounds slicing through the night. Barges caught fire, their soldiers screaming as flames devoured wood and flesh alike. Survivors leapt into the sea, clutching rifles that dragged them down as they sank beneath the waves. Logistics dictated tactics. The Japanese could not move large, well-defended convoys. They no longer had the naval strength. Instead, they dispersed their efforts, sending small groups of barges in multiple directions, each hoping to slip past the American net. But dispersal meant weakness, and weakness meant vulnerability. The Americans, with radar, patrol aircraft, and fast boats, exploited every gap. In the cold arithmetic of war, the Japanese gambled men against time, hoping a few would survive the crossing. And yet, amid the desperation, there was resolve. Many soldiers sang quiet songs in the night, clinging to tradition as they drifted toward their fate. Officers recited the emperor's commands, urging courage. In their eyes, they were not just men on barges, but warriors carrying the spirit of Japan into the heart of the battle. Even as barges burned around them, some pressed on, paddling with oars when engines failed, determined to reach Luzon's shores. The gamble, however, was doomed by the very imbalance of the war. Against Allied air superiority, submarine patrols, and PT boats that struck like phantoms, the fragile Japanese lifeline across Lingayen Gulf could not endure. Every night run that failed left Luzon weaker, its garrison more isolated, its defenses more brittle. The Gulf became not a corridor of reinforcement, but a graveyard, its waters littered with splintered hulls and the bodies of men who had bet their lives on the impossible. For Japan, reinforcing Luzon was a test of will against reality. For America, it was another demonstration of how industrial might, technological speed, and naval dominance crushed even the most determined opponent. And as the PT boats prowled the night waters, their engines growling low, they knew the outcome of the gamble before the dice were even thrown. The Gulf itself seemed to bear witness. By dawn, its waters carried the wreckage of another night's desperate voyage, burning timbers, floating helmets, and silence where once there had been men. The Japanese gamble was far from over, but with each failed crossing, its futility became clearer. The night was alive with tension, the Gulf stretching black and endless, beneath a sky pricked with stars. Engines growled low as PT boats skimmed across the waves, their wakes white streaks behind them. The men aboard were shadows against the gun mounts, gripping weapons and peering into the dark for any hint of movement. Suddenly, a flare burst into the sky, flooding the water with an eerie glow, and the outlines of Japanese barges materialized ahead, scores of them, pushing forward in tight formation, their decks crammed with soldiers bound for Luzon. For a moment, the Gulf held its breath. Then the Americans struck. From the bows of the PT boats, streams of .50 caliber tracers ripped across the night, fiery arcs that tore into wooden hulls and scattered splinters across the waves. Japanese gunners responded instantly, their weapons spitting orange sparks, bullets lashing the sea around the American craft. The battle became chaos, a brutal exchange in which survival hinged on speed and nerve. PT boats darted in and out, weaving like wolves around a herd, firing torpedoes that streaked beneath the water before erupting in geysers of fire and shattered wood. One barge after another burst apart, its cargo of men and weapons vanishing into the smoke. Yet the Japanese did not fold. Many barges pressed forward despite damage, their soldiers hurling grenades or firing rifles at silhouettes they could barely see. Some gunners fought until their craft sank beneath them. Others steered directly at the PT boats, attempting to ram, sacrificing themselves in desperate defiance. For the Americans, each pass was a brush with death. A burst of fire could punch through the thin plywood hull, setting gasoline alight. The crews lived every second on the edge, drenched in sweat, their ears deafened by the roar of engines and the endless chatter of machine guns. These duels repeated night after night. In one encounter, 3 PT boats cut into a formation of 15 barges, splitting them apart with torpedoes and relentless gunfire. Survivors recalled the sight of barges exploding into flames, soldiers leaping into the water as burning fuel spread across the waves. In another clash, a single PT boat was nearly overwhelmed when a group of barges closed in from multiple sides, their gunners pelting the craft with fire. Only by flooring the engines and zigzagging through the formation did the boat escape, leaving behind a trail of smoking wrecks. The cumulative toll was staggering. Each night, dozens of Japanese soldiers perished before they ever reached Luzon. Supplies sank to the bottom of the Gulf, rifles and ammunition lost forever. For every barge destroyed, the Allied invasion beaches were spared fresh defenders. Historians estimate that thousands of potential Japanese reinforcements were wiped out during these nocturnal battles, their lives cut short by the swift strikes of the Mosquito fleet. But the victories came at cost. PT crews returned to base with their boats riddled by bullet holes, decks scorched, and engines sputtering. Men carried wounds from shrapnel and burns, and many fought through exhaustion, knowing that another night would bring another patrol. They were acutely aware that a single lucky burst of enemy fire could turn their vessel into a funeral pyre. Yet they sailed again and again, driven by the knowledge that their actions were protecting the soldiers preparing to land ashore. By the end of the campaign, Lingayen Gulf had become a graveyard for Japan's reinforcement effort. The Gulf's waters were littered with debris, shattered planks, twisted metal, and the silent bodies of those who had gambled everything on reaching Luzon. The PT boats, scarred but undefeated, had crippled Japan's last attempt to hold the island. Through speed, daring, and relentless pursuit, they had transformed the darkness into their ally, turning every night into a slaughter that saved countless Allied lives. Yet even in victory, the Gulf remained restless. For each dawn that revealed smoldering wreckage on the waves, the men of the Mosquito fleet knew another night would soon fall, and with it, another clash in the darkness. ChatGPT said, "The sun climbed over Lingayen Gulf, spilling light across the largest armada the Pacific had ever seen. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and endless columns of transports stretched from horizon to horizon, their gray hulls glinting in the morning haze. On the decks, sailors squinted skyward, the sea breeze heavy with the smell of cordite from the night before. It was a fleeting calm, for daylight brought a new terror. Out of the eastern sky came a glint of silver, the rising wail of aircraft engines, and the sudden realization that the Japanese were coming, diving not to return, but to kill. The first kamikazes struck like lightning. A Zero plunged from the sun in a near-vertical dive, its wings shuddering as tracers climbed to meet it. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. For a moment, the fighter seemed to disintegrate under the barrage, but it kept coming, driven by the will of its pilot. Seconds later, it slammed into the superstructure of a destroyer, detonating in a burst of flame and steel. Sailors were hurled into the air, the ship's sirens wailing as fire engulfed the deck. On the horizon, another plume rose where a transport had been struck, its hold crammed with fuel and ammunition. For the men aboard Allied ships, the kamikaze threat was unlike anything they had faced. Bombers and fighters could be repelled, their pilots concerned with survival. But these aircraft had no intention of returning. They came on unwavering, indifferent to the storm of gunfire. Every sailor at a gun mount knew that if even one slipped through, the result could be catastrophic. The psychological toll was immense. Days became an unending cycle of scanning the skies, firing until barrels glowed red, and bracing for the fireball that might come crashing down at any moment. At the same time, in the dark waters of the Gulf, another battle unfolded. The PT boats returned from their nocturnal hunts scarred and exhausted, their decks littered with spent casings, their hulls patched with bullet holes. Crews snatched hours of rest in makeshift hammocks, only to wake at the thunder of anti-aircraft guns from the main fleet. Their role was not to duel kamikazes, but to strike at the sea lifeline that made those suicide missions possible. Each night, as the great ships above braced for attacks from the sky, the PT crews set out again into the black waters to hunt the barges that carried Japanese soldiers to Luzon. The juxtaposition was striking. By day, American sailors looked upward, defending against a storm of fire from the heavens. By night, their comrades looked outward across the sea, slicing into convoys with torpedoes and machine guns. Together, these battles formed Japan's last desperate strategy: cripple the Allied fleet with suicide planes, while reinforcing the island's defenses with barges and small transports. It was a two-pronged gamble designed to bleed the invaders and delay the inevitable. Yet both prongs faltered against Allied resilience. The kamikazes inflicted terrible damage. Dozens of ships were sunk or heavily damaged in the Lingayen campaign, and thousands of sailors were killed or wounded. But the sheer size of the fleet meant the losses, though tragic, could not halt the invasion. Destroyers stepped into the roles of those crippled, and transports kept pressing toward the beaches. The PT boats, in turn, ensured that Japanese reinforcements arriving by sea were shredded before they could reach Luzon. One by one, barges went up in flames, soldiers scattered across the water. The Japanese strategy was consumed in both fire and futility. For the men caught in these converging storms, the memory of those days was seared into their minds. A sailor on the battleship New Mexico recalled watching kamikazes dive in pairs, weaving through curtains of gunfire until one struck the ship, killing over 30 men in an instant. A PT crewman remembered the sight of Japanese soldiers leaping from burning barges into the Gulf, their cries swallowed by the roar of engines. Both scenes carried the same lesson. The Japanese were fighting with a level of desperation that disregarded survival entirely. The toll on morale was profound, yet the Americans adapted. Kamikaze attacks led to new formations, with destroyers and smaller ships forming picket lines to intercept suicide planes before they reached the heart of the fleet. PT boats increased their coordination with reconnaissance aircraft, turning night hunts into orchestrated strikes against barge convoys. Resilience became routine. The more Japan sacrificed, the more determined the Allies became to end the war swiftly. Lingayen thus became a crucible of contrasts: steel warships enduring the fire of the skies, wooden boats turning darkness into a weapon, and men caught between the twin storms of air and sea. Japan's dual strategy sought to shake American confidence, to make the invaders doubt their invincibility. Instead, it revealed the depths of Japan's desperation and the futility of resistance in the face of Allied might. When the beaches of Luzon finally erupted in the thunder of landing craft and artillery, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The kamikazes had bloodied the fleet, and the barges had carried their dead to the bottom of the Gulf, but neither had stopped the tide. Japan's twin threats had converged at Lingayen, and both had been broken. The first waves of American landing craft ground onto the sandy shores of Luzon, as the smoke of naval bombardment still hung over the coastline. Troops poured ashore under the deafening roar of artillery, their rifles raised, their boots sinking into wet sand already blackened by fire. Behind them, the sea churned with the endless approach of more vessels, an armada that seemed to stretch to the very horizon. Offshore, battleships still thundered, their shells whistling overhead to crash into the inland hills where Japanese positions clung stubbornly. For the men wading through the surf, there was no doubt. The tide had turned, and Luzon was being reclaimed. Yet the victory was not won in daylight alone. Every mile of beach taken by infantry was made possible by the unseen battles of the night, where PT boats prowled the Gulf and cut down Japanese reinforcements before they could reach the fight. The Japanese had gambled everything on their ability to funnel men and supplies across Lingayen Gulf. Instead, they found their wooden barges hunted relentlessly, shattered under torrents of machine gun fire and torpedo blasts. By the time American divisions stormed ashore, those reinforcements lay at the bottom of the Gulf. Without them, Luzon's defenders were left to fight in isolation, their numbers dwindling, their resistance doomed. The cost was immense. Villages along the Gulf's shores bore witness to the price of invasion. Many were reduced to ashes, caught between Japanese troops retreating inland and American bombardment pounding the coast. Civilians fled into the hills, carrying what little they could, often with children on their backs and the sound of gunfire in their ears. At sea, the waters themselves became graveyards. Barges packed with men and supplies burned fiercely before capsizing, their wreckage drifting ashore days later. Survivors clung to debris only to be swept away by the tide, their final cries drowned by the thunder of war. For the PT crews, exhaustion became their constant companion. Night after night, they raced into the Gulf, their engines screaming, their gunners firing until barrels glowed red. Each mission carried the same risks: ambush, fire, the chance of a single lucky bullet turning their fuel tanks into an inferno. They endured long hours in darkness, eyes strained from constant vigilance, ears ringing from the din. When they returned to base, their boats were scarred and battered, their crews hollow-eyed with fatigue. Yet they sailed again the next night, driven by the knowledge that every barge they sank meant fewer Americans cut down on the beaches at dawn. The collapse of Japanese resistance at Lingayen was not instantaneous, but it was inevitable. Cut off from reinforcement, starved of supplies, and battered by overwhelming American firepower, the defenders fought a losing battle. Entire regiments withered away in futile counterattacks, their commanders unable to coordinate across shattered lines. Inland, the once proud defenses of Luzon crumbled under the relentless Allied push. The Japanese Army's grand strategy, to stall the invasion long enough to force a negotiated peace, dissolved in the fires of Lingayen Gulf. What remained were the human stories: a Filipino villager guiding American scouts through the jungle, risking his life for the hope of liberation; an American sailor on a battleship, watching kamikazes dive and praying his gunners would not falter; a PT boat crewman gripping his machine gun in the dead of night, firing until his hands blistered, knowing that each trigger pull might mean survival for soldiers he would never meet. Their sacrifices intertwined, converging into a single outcome: the liberation of Luzon. By February, Manila itself would be the next battlefield, and the campaign there would descend into one of the most destructive urban battles of the Pacific. But the foundation for that fight was laid at Lingayen. The PT boats, the destroyers, the battleships, and the Marines and soldiers on shore had together ensured that the Japanese lifeline was severed. Luzon was no longer a fortress, it was a trap. The legacy of the Mosquito Fleet was written not in grand monuments or towering hulls, but in the silence of the Gulf after their work was done. They proved that small craft, manned by young and often inexperienced sailors, could alter the course of campaigns. Their speed, their daring, and their relentless pursuit transformed the night into a weapon that Japan could not counter. In doing so, they saved thousands of lives, preventing Japanese reinforcements from ever tipping the balance on the beaches of Luzon. When historians look back on the Pacific War, they often speak of Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, battles of immense scale and drama. Yet Lingayen carries its own lesson. Victory was not forged by might alone, but by the relentless grind of every element: air, land, and sea, working in concert. And in that vast orchestra of war, the PT boats played a piercing, decisive note. The Gulf, once filled with fire, eventually grew quiet again. The waves rolled over the wrecks of barges and the bones of men who had gambled everything against the tide. Luzon was liberated, but the price was written in ash, steel, and blood. For the Americans, it was a triumph that marked the beginning of the end. For the Japanese, it was the proof that no matter how fiercely they fought, the war was slipping from their grasp. And for the crews of the Mosquito Fleet, it was the validation of their grueling nights. proof that even the smallest ships could shape the fate of empires.